My name is Dr. Mark, and for the last 14 years, I had been working as a neurologist at the Starlight Medical and Research Institute. Throughout my career, I had encountered the most complex and heartbreaking cases that the human brain could present, from sudden paralysis to malignant brain tumors, from injuries caused by severe accidents to strokes that left families shattered, had seen it all. The human brain, in my eyes, was a universe of secrets. Every day was a new challenge, a new patient, and a new story that reminded me how fragile yet resilient life truly was. I often thought I had already experienced the extremes of neurological cases. After all, what could be stranger than watching the brain misfire and create illusions, or witnessing memory vanish like smoke? But destiny had something far more unusual in store for me. In the year 2022, an incident occurred that would shake my scientific understanding to the core. It was a case so bizarre, so unexplainable, that it connected not just to medicine, but to history itself, stretching back to the 15th century. That night, my life as a doctor would forever change. The night was quiet, almost unnervingly still. At around 11:30 p.m., I had already fallen asleep at home after a long day. Suddenly, my phone rang, its sharp sound slicing through the silence. It was the hospital. My heart sank for a moment, because late-night calls rarely meant anything ordinary. When I answered, the voice on the other end carried urgency. "Doctor, we need you immediately. A patient has been brought in with a condition we cannot explain. He's lost his entire sense of identity, and the situation is beyond our understanding. Please, come quickly." I dressed hurriedly and drove through the dimly lit streets, my mind racing with possibilities. Was it amnesia? A psychiatric breakdown? Some rare neurological disorder? But something in the caller's tone made me uneasy. As I entered the hospital, I saw a group of doctors waiting anxiously. Their expressions weren't just professional concern, they looked genuinely disturbed. One of them stepped forward and said, "Dr. Mark, this is not a normal case. The patient has completely abandoned who he was. He speaks in a strange, incomprehensible tongue. We believe only you can figure out what's happening." For the first time in my career, I felt a chill. This wasn't just medicine. Something far stranger awaited me. When I finally entered the observation ward, I saw him. A man in his early 30s, sat on the bed, restrained gently by two nurses. His eyes darted around the room as if everything surrounding him was alien. The patient's name, I was told, was Michael. According to his relatives, he had been perfectly normal, just hours earlier sharing a meal, talking, even laughing with his family, but within an hour of going to bed, something extraordinary had happened. He was found outside his house, nearly a kilometer away, wandering barefoot in the dark. When his family approached him, Michael didn't recognize them. Instead, he spoke in a strange language no one could understand, words that sounded old, almost ancient, like a forgotten form of English. When brought back home, his behavior grew more bizarre. He stared at the electric lights as if he had never seen such a thing in his life. He gazed into mirrors with a mix of wonder and fear, as though he was encountering his own reflection for the very first time. His family, horrified and desperate, brought him to the hospital, believing he had lost his sanity. But as I watched him, something inside me whispered, this was no ordinary psychiatric case. I approached Michael carefully, observing his movements and expressions. His eyes met mine briefly, and he muttered a string of words in that strange language, again sharp, unfamiliar sounds that carried an odd rhythm. None of the staff could understand him. At first, some thought it was gibberish, the ramblings of a man whose mind had collapsed. But the more he spoke, the clearer it became that this was structured, consistent speech. I ordered a quick neurological assessment, scans, blood work, and reflex tests. To my astonishment, everything came back normal. His brain activity showed no signs of trauma, seizure, or psychosis. His vitals were stable. This wasn't a damaged brain, it was something else entirely. To unravel the mystery of his speech, we contacted linguistics experts. Several scholars arrived, each specializing in ancient and forgotten languages. They listened intently as Michael spoke, their brows furrowing deeper with each phrase. Finally, one of them admitted, "This isn't any modern dialect. It resembles archaic English, perhaps from the medieval period. But it is far older and more complex than anything I've studied." The room fell silent. The idea that a modern man could suddenly begin speaking a language from centuries ago was beyond belief. Yet, here he was, alive before us, speaking words last heard in the 14th century. And then, in a clear, commanding voice, Michael declared, "My name is Richard." The moment the words left his lips, "My name is Richard," the air in the room grew heavy. His tone was firm, almost regal, carrying a weight that didn't match the fragile confusion of a hospital patient. The nurses exchanged nervous glances, while the other doctors shifted uncomfortably. I leaned closer and asked, gently, "Richard, who are you?" But instead of answering directly, he launched into a long passage in the same medieval tongue. The words rolled out fluently, with conviction, as though he had spoken this way all his life. We recorded his speech and played it. For a historian who specialized in medieval texts, after careful listening, the historian's face went pale. He whispered, "He is speaking Middle English. From the 14th century, he claims to be a man named Richard, who lived during the time of the plague." The revelation was staggering. How could a factory worker from 2022 suddenly assume the identity of a man from 6 centuries ago? Was this a psychiatric phenomenon, a neurological glitch, or something that defied all logic? As I studied Michael, or Richard, as he now insisted, I realized this was no ordinary case of amnesia or delusion. This was something unexplainable, something that might blur the line between science and the supernatural. Michael's family was brought into the ward, hoping their presence would trigger some recognition. His mother called his name softly, "Michael, it's me, your mother." But he only stared at her blankly, his eyes narrowing as though she were a complete stranger. When his brother stepped forward, Richard, or the man we knew as Michael, spoke in that same archaic language, his tone sharp and defensive. Later, when translated, we discovered he was demanding, "Who were these people, and why did they claim to know me?" The family was heartbroken. Tears filled the room as they begged him to remember them, but it was as if the soul of their loved one had been replaced by another. The lights in the hospital fascinated him. He reached out to the glowing bulbs, whispering in awe, as if seeing fire captured in glass. When he glimpsed his reflection in the window, he recoiled in shock, murmuring words that sounded like prayers or curses from another era. This wasn't merely memory loss. It was as though the consciousness of a 14th century man had truly awakened inside him. For the first time, I wondered, was I looking at a patient, or a man displaced from history itself? As the night deepened, my colleagues and I decided to treat this case with the utmost seriousness. Though some suggested it was a psychiatric break, I refused to dismiss what I had just witnessed. A man with no prior history of mental illness had suddenly begun speaking a language extinct for centuries. We ran every possible test: MRI scans, EEGs, extensive blood work. The results were frustratingly normal. His brain showed no sign of trauma, seizure activity, or degenerative disease. Physically, he was as healthy as any man his age. Yet mentally, he had become someone else entirely. To broaden our approach, I invited a team of historians and linguistic experts to the hospital. One of them, a middle-aged scholar with a deep knowledge of medieval Europe, listened carefully to Richard's speech. His hands trembled as he translated. "He says he is Richard, a man from England, who lived during the time of the plague." The scholar went on to explain that Richard described events consistent with the 14th century. Black Death details no modern man would casually invent. The realization sent shivers down my spine. During one of his Michael had somehow assumed Richard's identity, the question remained how. Was it a case of repressed memory, the linguist's eyes widened, or something far beyond science? He translated for us. Over the following days, I spent hours with him. Sometimes he remembers dying in the time, sometimes as Richard, surrounded by between the two identities was unpredictable. He says the year was 1347. Would look at me with confusion and ask, "Richard described crude medical practices. Where is my family?" The burning of bodies. Moments later, the ringing of his entire demeanor tolling endlessly for the dead. His posture would stiffen. His words carried his accent the weight of lived experience. And once again, yet this was in that medieval tongue, was a man of the 21st century. Every explanation I turned to, neurological, psychological, even cultural, failed me. Science had no language for what was happening. The thought that haunted me most was terrifying. Could the soul of a man dead for 6 centuries truly have awakened in my patient? By the third night, it became clear that Michael's mind was no longer a single identity. He existed in fragments, sometimes fully himself, sometimes entirely Richard. When he was Michael, he spoke in clear, modern English, recognized the hospital, staff, and even asked anxiously for his family. But without warning, he would slip into Richard's persona, his voice dropping into an older tone, his vocabulary twisting into words none of us could easily follow. I began documenting every transition, hoping to find a pattern, but there was none. The changes came like sudden storms, some predictable, overwhelming. What troubled me most was that when Richard took over, Michael seemed completely erased, as if he had been pushed aside, buried deep within. One evening, I sat beside him and asked Richard directly, "Why are you here? How did you come into this man's body?" He stared at me, his eyes dark and distant, and replied in his ancient tongue. The historian beside me translated with a trembling voice. He says he doesn't know. He awoke in a world of lights and glass, with faces he has never seen. He believes God has returned him to a body not his own. The room fell silent. I realized then we were no longer treating a medical condition. We were standing on the edge of a mystery that blurred the lines between medicine, history, and the unknown. The hospital staff grew increasingly unsettled. Nurses whispered in the corridors, and even seasoned doctors avoided entering the ward alone. Michael's condition was unlike anything we had ever encountered. He was not hallucinating, not delusional. He was living two lives at once. During one of his Richard phases, he grew agitated. He spoke rapidly, pointing at the fluorescent lights above. The translator explained. He says the sun has been captured. He calls it sorcery. Then, catching sight of a nurse with a stethoscope, he recoiled in fear. To him, every piece of modern equipment was witchcraft. But when the episode passed, and Michael returned, he wept uncontrollably. "Doctor," he said, his voice trembling, "what's happening to me? I see things, memories of places I've never been, people I've never met. I feel like someone else is living inside me." His despair shook me. This was no act, no performance. Both identities were real, and both were suffering. For Michael, it was the terror of being possessed by a stranger. For Richard, it was the agony of awakening in a world he could not comprehend. I found myself asking the unthinkable. Had two souls become trapped in one body? The historian we had consulted, an elderly man named Professor Ellis, requested more time with Richard. He believed that if Richard's words truly belonged to the 14th century, they might reveal something remarkable. We gathered in the observation room, watching through the glass as Ellis sat across from him. Richard spoke slowly, his voice solemn, describing the year of pestilence, the cries of the dying, and the endless funeral bells. Ellis listened carefully, scribbling notes, then suddenly froze, his face drained of color. When he returned to us, his voice was hushed. "He's not just speaking medieval English," Ellis said. "He's using a dialect specific to a small region of England during the mid-1300s, and he described events exactly as chroniclers recorded them. The burning of plague houses, the mass graves, details no ordinary man from this century could possibly know." The room grew quiet. One doctor muttered nervously, "Are you saying this man is a ghost?" Ellis shook his head. "I'm saying his knowledge is impossible to explain. Either he has studied medieval history with inhuman precision, or something extraordinary has happened here." That night, as I reviewed the notes, I realized something chilling. If Richard truly was who he claimed to be, then Michael's body was no longer entirely his own. By the fourth day, the struggle between Michael and Richard intensified. His body could barely contain the weight of two identities. At times he would wake up screaming, clutching his head, shouting in modern English, "Get out of me, leave me alone." Moments later the screams would stop, and his face would shift into calm dignity as Richard emerged, demanding to know why he had been imprisoned in this hall of sorcery. The rapid alternation was taking a toll. His pulse spiked dangerously, and he complained of splitting headaches. Still, every medical test remained normal. His brain scans showed nothing unusual, yet his consciousness was tearing itself apart. I spent long hours by his bedside, trying to bridge the two selves. I asked Richard to describe his final memory. He grew silent, then whispered words that chilled me. "I remember the bells, the coughing, the black sores. I remember falling to the ground as death took me. Then I awoke here, in this body that is not mine." Michael later admitted he could feel Richard's presence like a shadow inside him. "It's like he's watching me from the back of my mind," he said. His eyes pleaded with me. "Doctor, am I dying, or am I already dead?" I had no answer. In an attempt to understand the depth of his duality, I performed what we call a mirror test. The idea was simple. Place a mirror before him, and observe how each identity responded. When Michael was present, he looked at his reflection with tears in his eyes. "That's me," he whispered, almost as if reassuring himself. His voice cracked. "I don't want to disappear." But when Richard emerged, the reaction was violently different. He flinched as if seeing a ghost. His hand hovered above the glass, trembling. Then he shouted in Middle English, demanding to know why his soul was trapped inside the face of a stranger. The translator scribbled furiously as Richard's voice filled the room. "This is not my face. I was taken. Who has stolen my form?" His anguish was so raw that even the nurses could not hold back their tears. Afterward, Michael returned, exhausted and shaking. He confessed that he could see Richard's memories bleeding into his own visions of cobblestone streets, smoke from burning bodies, the ringing of church bells tolling endlessly for the dead. The mirror test confirmed what I feared most. Richard was not a delusion. He was real, a consciousness trying to survive inside another man's body. By the end of the week, the struggle inside Michael grew fiercer. His body shook during transitions, as though two invisible forces were pulling him in opposite directions. The nurses described nights where he would thrash violently in bed, calling out both names, Michael and Richard, as if the two identities were at war. During one particularly intense episode, Richard took over with such force that it terrified everyone present. His eyes blazed with anger, and he spoke with authority, demanding to be released from this cursed shell. His words, translated later, were haunting. "You bind me with chains of fire and glass. I will not remain in this prison." But only minutes later, Michael reappeared, sobbing uncontrollably. "Doctor, he wants to take me away," he said, clutching my hand. "He doesn't care if I live or die. He just wants this body for himself." It was then that I realized the truth. This was no peaceful coexistence. It was a war for dominance. Only one identity could remain, and whichever one won, the other would vanish forever. That night, as I left the hospital, a terrifying thought struck me. What if Richard succeeded? What if Michael's soul was erased, and a man from the 14th century walked among us once again? Faced with this impossible situation, I gathered a team of experts, neurologists, psychiatrists, historians, and even theologians. Each came with their own theory, but none could fully explain what we were witnessing. The neurologists insisted it might be a rare form of dissociative identity disorder, triggered by stress or trauma. Yet when I reminded them that Michael had never studied medieval history and could not possibly speak fluent Middle English, they had no response. The psychiatrists leaned toward psychosis, but again, the accuracy of Richard's descriptions challenged their view. He spoke of events from the plague years that aligned perfectly with historical records, down to the exact rituals used to bury the dead. The historian, Professor Elise, argued this was beyond science. "This man carries knowledge that should not exist in his century," he said gravely. "Either we are facing the rarest case of hidden memory or we are looking at something metaphysical." And then came the theologian, who spoke with unsettling calm. "If two souls inhabit one vessel, then one does not belong here. The question is not medical, doctor, it is spiritual." That night, as I replayed Richard's words in my mind, I wondered if we were on the brink of discovering something humanity was never meant to uncover. Asterisk. The next morning, I sat with Richard during one of his longer episodes. I wanted answers not from Michael, but from the man who claimed to have died centuries ago. "Richard," I asked firmly, "what do you remember about your last moments?" He stared past me, his expression haunted. His words came slowly, each carrying the weight of memory. "I remember the bells, tolling for the dead, the streets filled with carts of corpses, my wife's face, pale and blistered, my children, gone before I could bury them. I remember falling to the earth, choking, and then darkness. For so long, only darkness, until I opened my eyes in this strange body." The room was silent. Every person present felt the chill of his words. These were not vague, invented images. This was lived trauma, spoken with raw detail. I asked him why he thought he was here. His reply was terrifying in its simplicity. "Perhaps I was not ready to die. Perhaps the Lord has given me another chance. But this is not my flesh. This is not my time." In that moment, I realized Richard did not see himself as a ghost or illusion. He believed he was alive again, reborn in Michael's body. As days passed, the conflict inside Michael grew unbearable. His family, though devastated, tried to visit often, but each time, Richard's presence only deepened their despair. He looked at them with confusion, sometimes with suspicion, and once even demanded they stop calling him by a name that was not his own. Michael, when he resurfaced, was fragile and broken. He clung to his mother's hand, whispering, "Please don't give up on me. I'm still here." But his voice trembled with fear, because he knew Richard was stronger each time he returned. Then came the breaking point. One night, in the middle of an episode, Richard attempted to escape the hospital. He ripped out his eye forth, shoved past the nurses, and ran down the corridor barefoot, shouting in his archaic tongue. It took 3 orderlies to restrain him. When translated, his words were horrifying. "You cannot keep me in chains. This is my body now." When Michael returned hours later, he was inconsolable. "Doctor," he sobbed, "he's winning. I can feel him pushing me away. One day I'll wake up, and I won't come back." His fear was real, and for the first time, I had to face a question I dreaded. If Richard succeeded, would Michael be lost forever? Desperation pushed me to attempt one last experiment. If Richard truly believed he belonged to another time, perhaps confronting him with undeniable proof of the present could disrupt his hold. We brought him into a specially prepared room, filled with modern objects, a television, a laptop, photographs of skyscrapers, even a smartphone playing live news. At first, Richard reacted with shock. He touched the screen cautiously, recoiled at the sound of voices emerging from a box, and whispered prayers under his breath. I asked him directly, "Richard, do you still believe this is your world?" He hesitated, his eyes darting around the room. Then, with a trembling voice, he said, "This is witchcraft, sorcery beyond the devil himself. If this is the world of men, then I do not belong here." For a fleeting moment, I saw doubt flicker in his face, as though he finally realized this body, this time, was not his. His grip on reality faltered, and in that instant, Michael surfaced, gasping for air, as if he had been drowning. "Doctor," he whispered, clutching my arm. "He's gone, at least for now." But the question haunted me. Was Richard truly gone, or simply waiting in the shadows of Michael's mind? For several days after the experiment, Richard did not reappear. Michael slowly regained strength, speaking clearly, recognizing his family again, and recalling his life as if nothing had happened. His mother wept when he called her by name, holding him tightly, as if afraid he might vanish again. The medical team was cautious but relieved. Every scan, every test remained perfectly normal. It was as though the nightmare had passed, leaving behind only confusion and unanswered questions. When I asked Michael what he remembered, he shook his head. "It's all fragments," he said, "like someone else's dreams, dark streets, funeral bells, a man's voice crying out through me. But it doesn't feel like mine." Though he was improving, I couldn't dismiss the truth. I had seen Richard with my own eyes, heard his words, felt the weight of his presence. This was no simple psychological episode. Something extraordinary had happened within Michael, a crossing of 2 worlds, 2 lives, 2 centuries. As I signed the discharge papers, Michael smiled weakly and said, "Thank you, doctor. I think I'm myself again." I wanted to believe him, but a shadow lingered in my thoughts. Richard had come once before. What if he returned? Michael eventually returned home, and life seemed to resume its normal rhythm. He went back to his family, his work, his ordinary routines. Yet for me, nothing would ever feel ordinary again. I often found myself sitting alone in my office late at night, staring at his case file. Every report read the same. All results normal. Neurological function intact. Psychological assessment inconclusive. On paper, he was healthy. But what I had witnessed was beyond the reach of science, beyond the boundaries of medicine. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still hear Richard's voice, ancient, sorrowful, pleading for a body that was never his. I wonder, was he truly a lost soul from the 14th century? Or was this some hidden capacity of the human brain that we cannot yet explain? One truth remains. For a brief time, 2 men from 2 different centuries shared a single body. And when Richard vanished, he left behind questions that no textbook can answer, even today. Years later, I asked myself, was Richard truly gone? Or does some fragment of him still live, buried deep in Michael's mind, waiting for the right moment to awaken? Again, it was, and will always remain, the most astonishing case of my career.